Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is a recent read for 7 I think books. Endling by Reva, which is on this year's Booker long list. Madeleine Thien, The Book of Records. Migraine by Samuel Fisher. The People of Paper by Salvador Plascencia. Was this translated or was it written in English originally? Looks like it was written in English. Yeah, okay. Nicola Barker's new novel, Tony Interruptor. Catherine Lacey's novel, Pew. Nathalie Leger's Suite for Barbara Loden, and this must have been translated, by Natasha Lera and Cecile Menon. And finally, The Singularity by Dino Buzzati, translated by Anne Milano Appel from the Italian. Okay, so let's start with Endling. When the Booker long list came out, I think I'd read 2 of the titles, and of the others, this is the only one that appealed to me. And very rewarding. I'm really glad I picked it up. It's a very arch and slyly comic book. That's slyly, not slightly. So it's set in Ukraine on the eve of the war being expanded from the Crimea to throughout all of Ukraine, with the Russians massing on the border. And it has 3 female characters who are all involved in the bridal industry, that thing of encouraging bachelors or divorcees from the West to come over and basically sweep a young Ukrainian woman off her feet and take her back and indulge them in the life of luxury, which of course is not always what it's cracked up to be. And one of the women who does this, her main aim in life is to rescue endangered snails and to help them breed to increase their population size. And indeed, the word endling is a term for the last one of any species that will go extinct when it dies, because it has no one to mate with, no one to reproduce with. And this woman is was very dedicated to her sort of snail saving rescues, but is increasingly hitting the bottle and making mistakes and sort of causing the death of her snails. So it's all going tits up. And she's in this bridal agency just to make money. She has no intention of finding a partner, but she just uses it to basically subsidise her scientific work. And the other 2 are sisters, and one is the bride-to-be, and the other is her translator, because obviously when people from the West come over who only speak English or German or whatever, and even if the Ukrainians can speak English, the agency insists that there's a translator between them, so there can be no or less chance of misunderstanding. Now, these 2 sisters are doing it, again, not because they want to be married off and swept off into the West, but because their mother has gone missing, and their mother was an activist. And what was her protest? It was against these type of bridal agencies, these sort of matchmaking agencies. And she used to perform stunts where she would, strip her clothes off, and there'd be messages across her chest at these various sort of matchmaking events. But she's been missing for 6 months, and the sisters, particularly the younger sister, who's more driven to find her mother, believes that if word gets back to her mother, as she believes it inevitably will, that her daughters are indulging in the very practice in which the mother spent a lifetime protesting, it will draw her out of hiding. So those are the 3 main characters. And as I say, it's very, very funny, very sly. Things like the snail scientist, she's sitting down with her sort of speed dating bachelors, and while they're talking at her, all she's thinking about is the difficulty of snail sex, how involved it is, and how sort of intricate it is. All this within the setting of men wanting to marry women and indulge in sex. So it's just, as I say, it's very sly like that. Another really funny line. Nastia's eyes again turned to the TV screen that hung along the banquet room's walls, the one streaming the day's news. Nothing about traffic disruptions, bridge closures, flash mobs creating the day of romance. Instead, a map of Ukraine, its easternmost edge pulsing red. The Russians were transferring mobile hospitals and supplies of blood to the border. Further proof that these weren't simply training exercises. But that threat seemed far away, unimaginable. The day of the invasion predicted by the American counterintelligence kept getting pushed back, like an ill-fated wedding, while her mother's imminent arrival felt concrete, inevitable. So in there you've got everything sort of tied up, really. You've got, the search for her mother, the imminence of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the invasion predicted by American counterintelligence kept getting pushed back, like an ill-fated wedding. And again, this sort of Ukrainian brides thing. And basically, the snail scientist is on the point of sort of suicide. She's so despairing that she's, wrecked her life's work of saving snails. And the two sisters realise, they've been at this long enough and their mother still hasn't come out of hiding, so they feel they really have to grab her attention. So what they plot is that they're going to persuade the snail scientist to help to lend them her sort of trailer in which all her experiments and frozen snails and everything were kept. They let them borrow it, and they're going to kidnap 12 of the bachelors, and then it'll become a huge news story, and that will draw the mother out. But in the end, the snail scientist sort of goes along with them. So they sort of lure these 12 bachelors for an after party, after the sort of dating event, and then they drive off. And unfortunately, they drive off at the point at which the Russians invade. So the plot is them sort of navigating throughout Ukraine, through the war zone, and trying to dodge the war and everything. So it becomes less funny, although I will say Andrei Kurkov's recent book called The Grey Bees, which is written about the Russian invasion of Crimea, it's very similar, and it's sort of snails. His theme was bees. A guy was driving around with bees, trying to find a sort of ideal summer quarters for them that he traditionally had always done. But because it's in a war zone now, it's much, much harder. So very similar theme, but whereas Kurkov's was very melancholic in tone, quite understandably, this is still funny. Now, the extra added element of this book, which really made it an absolute winner for me, is that there are metafictional elements. And the metafictional elements is an inquiry by the author, not necessarily Maria Reva, but an author character, into, first of all, why would you choose to write a book about the sort of two worst stereotypes of Ukraine women, which is that they all go through these marriage agencies, bridal agencies, and equally the Ukrainian women who protest that, who's the missing mother figure, that there's a certain element of guilt about sort of harping on these sort of external views of Ukraine, added to the fact that now Ukraine is involved in a war of survival. How can you sort of focus on such trivial things, again, as a bridal agency or whatever? And she includes things like letters from publishers sort of saying, we want more like your first book. How can you write about sort of, as I say, bridal women agencies, all this sort of stuff. There's a very funny sort of letter that she's writing to a funding body, and the language of that is very sort of po-faced and over the top. So the metafictional element, which sort of comes quite early, about a quarter of the way through, is brilliant. It's really clever. And then we get back to the plot, and you think that the metafictional elements have dropped off completely by that it was just a sort of a one-off. But in fact, they do reappear in again, quite subtle ways. So there's a part of the plot where, because they've lost a couple of the bachelors, one has been shot by the Russians, the other, who himself was of Ukrainian origin, although he grew up in the States, has come back to try and find a Ukrainian wife. He sort of gets swept up into the Ukrainian resistance against the Russians. So they're down a couple of bachelors, And the woman who owns this bridal agency, who's very rich and lives in America, she's sort of saying, well, you owe me 2 bachelors, but you know, if you can't get them back, I need you to rescue a relative of mine who refused to join us when we left Ukraine ahead of this crisis. So they go and sort of try and persuade this elderly gentleman to join them. But it's done really, really cleverly, because the chapters are numbered, but then there's this sort of section where the chapter numbers don't change, so they're all, I can't remember exactly what number it is, but let's say it's chapter 26, so it's chapter 26, then chapter 26, because it's melding the fictional plot element of trying to get this guy to leave with a true life experience, or it suggests it's a true life experience of Reva and her sister going back to Ukraine after the war has started, trying to persuade an elderly uncle of theirs to join them and to get out of Ukraine. And it brilliantly, you know, merges from the, it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense if you're just treating it at a plot level. And then you realise that no, that she's feeding in her own experience of trying to do this. And then it reverts back to the plot and trying to get this guy. It's brilliant. It's really, really clever and smart. It's funny. And it's biting, it's trenchant. You know, this is a book about someone of Ukrainian extraction talking about the current terrible situation in Ukraine. 5 stars. And I'm really glad it's on the book list. You know, I won't have read 9 of the titles or whatever. So it might be a bit sort of throwaway of me to say this, but I hope it wins. And on to Madeleine Thien's latest book, The Book of Records, which is brilliant, but also slightly frustrating. It's beautifully written. There's lots of deep philosophical insight. There's some really interesting ideas, but it seems to me to be 2 different books, wedged together in one. So it's a book that's set in a sort of liminal interspace where people who are forced to flee their homelands end up waiting for transport on. They've got out of their sort of homelands, and but until the right transport comes to take them to where they want to go, they're sort of stuck in this place. And the interesting thing about that is, it doesn't matter where you've come from. Whenever you look out at the sea between you and what the country across the land, you perceive that country across the land is where you fled from. So, for example, the main characters have fled from China, so they perceive over the sea is China, whereas people from Africa perceive it to be the country in Africa they fled from. So that's the first really interesting thing, and about this community and this sort of, liminal space is really well developed. But then very quickly we go into a sort of historical, fictional writings about 3 historical figures, because it's a little girl and her father who fled to this place, and their mother and the son, or the girl's brother, are still left behind or have gone somewhere else. They split from, and one of the few possessions that the girl has that the father grabbed for her as they were leaving is part of a 78-book series on historical figures who were migrants of the mind. And the 3 volumes that he grabbed for her are Baruch Spinoza, the philosopher from 17th century, who was residing in Holland. Hannah Arendt, 20th century philosopher who had to flee the Nazis. That was her migration. Spinoza's was a migration from his own Jewish heritage. I'll get back into that. And the third is a Chinese poet from, 11th century, something like that, called Fu Du. So we get most of this book is about the lives of these 3 as narrated in this liminal space, seemingly by people who resemble them, or ghosts. I mean, it's never really established quite what their status is, but they know an awful lot about them, and they are relaying their stories. Now, I know a lot about Hannah Arendt, so I knew a lot of the stuff about her that's referred to in here already. Never heard of the Chinese poet. So for me, I guess the Spinoza was the most enlightening. So he basically denied the existence of the human soul, and if you deny the existence of the human soul, then you're sort of threatening the existence of God, even though it's not quite that explicit in the 17th century. We had to wait till later. years before that. And he's basically excommunicated by the Jewish community in Amsterdam for heresy. And he has to support himself, so he becomes a trainee apprentice in lens grinding, because this is the 17th century, this is the era of huge advancements in the precision of lenses that led to both microscopes and telescopes. So it's a hugely important, pivotal part of human history through science. And ironically, of course, a science that increasingly takes us away from God, which is the journey that Spinoza has made to some extent, you know, even before utilising these lenses. So I thought his story was really interesting because it was about the Enlightenment and science's sort of increasing, taking over from religious superstition. The Arendt stuff, as I say, I knew. The Chinese was interesting because while Spinoza and Arendt were definitely rebellious minds, very much going against the status quo, both of their communities and their thinking, Du Fu was, although he was a poet, all he wanted in life was to get a civil service job to the local emperor, to basically set up himself and his family to be able to afford, you know, to provide for his family. And he keeps, you know, getting rejected. And he keeps putting in new applications with more and more sort of literary and poetic praises to the emperor. So actually he was very conventional, but he was still on the outside because he wasn't part of the emperor's entourage, which is what he aspired to most. So those are the three stories. As I say, they dominate the book, which I found slightly disappointing because actually when Thien returns to the contemporary period, both in this sort of strange liminal space, but also the story of why the father and the daughter had to flee China. There's some fascinating and really interesting ideas which I wish had been the book, really. So he is involved in sort of internet technology, and there's a sort of, because the Chinese Communist Party has this sort of all-encompassing power and oppression, that there's no freedom, he and certain colleagues form a sort of resistance group, and because China's so massive and the army's, you know, 1 million strong, you can't take them on at that level. So they decide they're going to sort of wage war over cyberspace. And he is obsessed with the relationship of surface, which is all the sort of matrix of power that the CCP have set up. But he believes in a theory, what he calls perforation, that if you can perforate the surface with enough holes, it will all collapse. So they're sort of trying to find this sort of cyber technology, which will enable them to perforate the whole system and bring it all crashing down. They're discovered. He flees with his daughter. But there were some really, really interesting ideas abounding in that. So I'm going to finish up. So I'm going to say this book is 4 stars. It would have got 5. But I did feel I was less engaged in the 3 historical biographies. I mean, it sort of reminded me very much of the work of Benjamin Lebertout, if you've read him. Books like The Maniac, and I'll post links to my reviews of his work. I'm not that interested in historical biographies done within fiction. That's not strictly true, because I really like the work of someone like Lance Olsen. But I didn't know I was going to get Spinoza, Arendt and Du Fu, whereas with Lance Olsen, because the book's said to be dedicated to a single figure, you know who the subject of his novel is. So I did knock a star off for that, because I felt slightly frustrated we didn't get more emphasis and more focus on this really interesting liminal space for migrants, but also what was going on in China. I thought it was a really interesting analysis of an unspoken war that's being waged in very limited small pockets in China against this sort of, as I say, this sort of, deadened hand of power and oppression. So as I say, I'm just going to read certain sections as a combination of how good a writer she is and some really interesting ideas that she offers. So this is Hannah Arendt, who, as a biographical detail and also covered in this book, when she was a university student, one of her professors was Martin Heidegger, the philosopher, and that they had an affair. And Heidegger went on to be a pretty flagrant supporter of Nazism once the Nazis came to power, and obviously she was Jewish, so there's that contradiction with Wittgenstein, who's pro-Nazi and yet had a Jewish girlfriend. Anyway, so once she's on the move out of Germany, she has hooked up with a communist called Heinrich, so he has to flee because he's a communist. I can't remember if he's Jewish or not, but Arendt's fleeing because she's Jewish. So Heinrich says, "You need not always speak to me," he teased, "in such a doctoral tone." She warned him, "In love, I treat you as I treat myself." "In love with me," he said, "you'll come to treat yourself better." Weeks later, he said, "I love you with all my soul, Hannah." She shrugged. The soul does not exist. That gives you a pretty good idea on Hannah Arendt's, character. She doesn't brook any shit, and she doesn't take any prisoners. So this is obviously Du Fu, the poet, and in a consideration of Lao Tse. "Nice touch, this Bertolt Brecht is an okay poet, but it's all made up. Everything the servant boy writes down was actually composed by different people who lived in different centuries. That's how the text, the Tao Te Ching, survived. It was all thanks to the work of various compiler writers whose names are lost to history. Lao Tzu never existed. He's a figment of our imaginations to hide the fact that we don't know the source of the words we inherited." In his room, Bento laughed. Blucher's typewriter paused. "Are you trying to wake up Ina's father?" she thundered. "Don't you know he's not feeling well?" Bento came and leaned over the doorway. He tried to play peacemaker by changing the subject. "Your Chinese poet, Du Fu, did he really fail at life?" "Life spat Du Fu out, but failure isn't the whole story," Jupiter said. Bento shuffled in and flopped down on Jupiter's bed. The stray cat who loved Bento leapt up beside him, a puff of orange. "You know Du Fu's entire life story like the back of your hand." "I read poetry. You should try it." "You do know a lot about Du Fu," I said gently. Jupiter looked mournfully at the poem he had just copied. "What am I," he said, "other than the things I know?" What are any of us but the things we know? I mean, what a philosophical concept. What are we but the summation of everything we know, we've learned, we've experienced, and we've remembered? So, you know, she's an incredible writer. There's no getting away from it. It's just I felt the structure of this book didn't best serve it. I thought this was a really interesting. This goes back to this notion of surface and perforations. I think this beautifully summarises up our relationship to the internet and cyberspace. There were government moles everywhere, we learned, but most only burrowed into the superficial exterior. Inside, like the rings of a tree, were encircled worlds, triple agents and spies with no loyalties, consultants who sided with the angels, the devils, or the highest bidders, disruptors driven by revenge or just boredom. In this hall of mirrors, one encountered adventurers and career diplomats, missionaries and do-gooders. It wasn't the digital realm that was perforated, he thought. Rather, the vastness of any space worked its way, day by day, month by month, into every individual, until each person was stretched thin, pulled as far as they could bear, until they became only surfaces and finally were no more. What better summation is of us living our lives online, until each person was stretched thin, pulled as far as they could bear, until they became only surfaces and finally were no more. So those who live their lives online, they're living at a surface level of a faceless interface, if you will, and they, you know, until they disappear into an echo chamber where they're just this disembodied voice. I thought, you know, a brilliant sort of concept, really. And the last thing I'm going to read from it. So this is about one of the things, obviously, that a lot of the migrants are fleeing from is climate change and flooding and the rise of water levels. The rise and fall of oceans is the breathing in, breathing out of the planet. It is not government cruelty that drives us to redraw the map of the Pearl River Delta. This is simply the shape of the earth in our time. We must live and flourish in our own age, not in the map of the past. So, as I say, so much to admire in this book, but as a whole it doesn't quite work. 4 stars. On to Migraine by Samuel Fisher, who's a British author. And it's really hard to do politics well in a book without being sort of didactic and preachy and all these sorts of things. This manages it marvellously. This is so seamless in how it weaves politics in. So it's set in a London that has had 5 years of big freeze, almost a sort of a mini ice age, in which everything ground to a halt, just like lockdown. And it's worth saying that Samuel Fisher in the acknowledgements seems to be alluding to the fact that he has suffered long COVID. And I think this book is about COVID and lockdown, not necessarily about the Great Freeze. And after the thaw, there's a new affliction that strikes most people, which is migraines, hence the title of the book. And there are lots of theories as to, why people are suffering with migraines. Is it simply that the sort of air pressure has changed after the big freeze? Now you have all these storms that, are they causing the migraines? But this is rebutted by a powerful group of people who aren't sufferers of migraines. And what they represent is that whole sort of toxic masculinity, I'm all right, Jack, everybody else is weak and, the source of their own problems. Because what they're saying is, no, you have these migraines, if indeed you even have them, because you're weak, because you've allowed yourself to be traumatised by events, whereas we were mentally strong and we resisted, and hence we don't have migraines. So it's a really interesting statement of the current position of things like anti-vaxxers and all the other conspiracy theories, and how that has sort of leaked into public discourse and is treated seriously enough to demand rebuttal, which it's, while it's there, the point is that it's set the agenda. Culture wars are the political agenda in many countries in the West, rather than the bigger themes of, economics and, war in Ukraine and Palestine, all this sort of stuff. And the main character, he does not suffer from migraines. He's not on the toxic masculinity wing, but he doesn't suffer from migraines. And then one day, eventually, he does. So the book really opens with him suffering his first migraine. And I will say that some of the descriptions of the migraines and what people see and experience and feel are just brilliant in here. Really, really well done. And so he's now sort of finding himself having to navigate a whole new world. And he split up from his girlfriend because she was a migraine sufferer and he wasn't. And even though he wasn't a bastard, there was this divide between them. He can never enter her world and understand her world. She is an influencer and a blogger because lots of people write, because it's so endemic, a lot of people write about the experience of migraines, try and help each other, try and be a support group. And she's one of the best. So her whole life is wrapped around her migraines and writing about them. But they split up. And now, of course, he has joined her camp because he suffered a migraine. So the book is a journey through Hackney in northwest London to Islington, I think. And he's seeking after his girlfriend. He wants to go back to her, presumably because he can say, look, I now know exactly what it is you feel because I'm now a victim. And he hooks up with this other guy because after his first migraine, he fainted. And this guy basically saves him, pulls him in from a storm. And he sort of runs a bookshop, more of which anon. So the two of them go on this quest, really, to cross a modest part of London, which is very much, I think, a love letter to Hackney. Because another thing about Samuel Fisher is he runs a publishing company, but he also owns a bookshop, where, in fact, my book launch, The Three Dreams of the Kia G, was done. It's in Hackney, Dalston. So I think this is very much a love letter to the area of Hackney as they pass through it. Now, the interesting thing, and again, this is where the politics is so seamlessly done, I feel, that after the snow, after the thaw, that the people who stayed and sort of fought through it, rather than flee, they're sort of rebuilding what's left of London, and they're doing it through a sort of syndicalist approach, a communal approach. There's no money, there's no economy, but if you put in the hours helping at a food bank, you get food. If you put in the hours serving drinks in a pub, then you get access to the homebrew ersatz Guinness. It's not real Guinness, it's the best they could do with the resources they have, because resources are still very limited. So there's this sort of collective, hopeful, it's come out of the ruins of a disaster, of a catastrophe, but it's very much this sort of collective, communal, syndicalist approach. Again, another thing that the I'm All Right Jack Brigade of Toxic Masculinity oppose. And it's just, as I say, it's just brilliantly done, throughout. It's constantly political. It's that thing of the personal is the political, which you may or may not agree with. But it's at that level that even though this is a book telling a story, telling the story of a journey, what they see, what they experience from Hackney to Islington, it is weaving in the political, but it's not ladling it on thick. That's the beauty of this book. And it's so contemporary. It's about lockdown, it's about post-lockdown, it's about the sort of divisions across society, the tribalism over views and ideologies rather than anything else. Brilliantly done. And just to give you an idea of the writing, so this is the bookseller talking to him. He's talking about one of his old customers who sort of was in every week buying books. A good friend to have. How long have you known him? Must have been 15 years. He wouldn't have thought of me as a friend, though, I don't suppose. You see someone every week. Piece by piece you learn every detail of their lives, what's happening with their doctor, how they dread their granddaughter's calls, her inane questions, a constant reminder of how it's all too little, too late. And then one week you notice they haven't been in for a little while. Their uncollected orders are stacking up under the desk. You call them, no one answers, and then again another customer comes along, and then you forget about it again. Until a few months later when you get a call one day out of the blue. A young woman who found your number on a postcard on her granddad's desk when she was clearing it out. Do you want to buy some books? And then they're back on the shelves, each one an episode in a conversation, the chain that it formed off, carried off link by link. I mean, what a beautiful statement about, marking someone's passing and everything about their life that they've shared with you through he's in the shop buying books, and when he's gone, when he's died, the daughter, who never sort of appreciated her grandfather's love for books, just said, "Oh, I've got all these books, do you want them?" without realising that he's the shop where they came from in the first place. But not only the books, but the buying of those books, the time shared in the shop, talking, sharing of one's lives, it's just so beautiful and poignant. And that's why this book is so good, of a mixture of the personal and the emotional with the political. Fantastic, 5 stars. And on to The People of Paper by Salvador Plascencia, who is Mexican origin but lives in America, or lived in America. I don't know if he's still alive. And this is a wonderfully subversive book as well. I really, really enjoyed this. So it's a Californian town, small town, dominated by Mexican flower pickers, carnation pickers, and the leader, the de facto leader, he's not mayor or anything, but he's a very influential chap. He feels that he is being spied upon either by Saturn the planet or from someone who's hiding behind Saturn the planet. And in order to block this out, he forms the flower pickers into a gang. But they're not a gang who arm themselves with weapons and go out, who can you fight with Saturn, the planet? There's no one locally. So what they do instead is they resolve that they're going to shield themselves from Saturn's beady gaze by erecting lead structures over their houses and everything, so they can't be spied upon, their thoughts can't be heard or can't be read. And the whole town does this. And then gradually, of course, they get sick from lead poisoning, so that strategy isn't going to work. So they have to change tack. And what's so good about this book is, and I've thought about this question very hard. The question of world building, I normally associate world building with things like fantasy worlds and science fiction worlds. But in a way, this is world building. Whereas other people might point to this book and go, oh no, it's just magical realism. That you've got the sort of day-to-day sort of mundane things. There's something that'll burst into this sort of crazy, you know, magical realist thing. I don't think it is magical realism, but if it's not magical realism, then it brings me back to the question of, well, is it world building? He's established this world. These are the rules of the world. It's recognisable from our world, as, let's face it, most fiction is, even fantasy and science fiction. But it's tweaked enough that you know, the rules are different. Cause and effect are different. I'm still not come down onto the notion of whether world building belongs in literary fiction or not. As I say, it belongs in genre fiction, fine. Does it exist, and does it... I mean, to some extent, every book thrusts you into its world. You know, when you open the book and start page 1, you don't know the world of that book unless you've done research on it. So, to some extent, the world of that book has to be sketched in. But normally in literary fiction, that's done through the language. It's not done through description necessarily. It's done by, as I say, it's done by language. But in most sort of literary fiction, you don't have to provide a set of rules that are different from the rules by which we operate in our daily lives. So it's not world building in that sense, but it is introducing you. You know, is this happening in India or is this happening in Peru? That is a decision that the author, you know, you have to absorb from page 1 from the author. So I'm in two minds about this notion of world building. But to me, this was a book set in, as I say, in California amongst an immigrant population who feel besieged by this sort of greater power and are striving to combat it. But all throughout, it's just sort of brilliant characterisation. So there's a character, for example, so she's fled another town in which everything was rotting and disintegrating. And like the lead sheath of this town, her town sort of protected themselves from everything falling to bits by constructing things out of plastic. Everything was made from plastic, but she hated plastic. She couldn't live there. So she moved and she came to this town. Two of the other characters, one of them heats up Phillips screwdrivers, the cross-thread one, and sort of self-harms with them, which is a horrible thing. But then you realise what she's done, or I think it was a he, what he's done is he's given himself a whole load of tattoos of stars, effectively, or scarification of stars because of the 4-point cross-ply of a Phillips screwdriver. Another character, to feel intense, and this is the question, are they doing it to feel intensely, or are they doing it to block out feeling? It can go either way. So another character is perpetually capturing bees and deliberately thrusting them into her skin where their stingers sting her, toxify her, and the stingers remain in her skin because they snap off the bee and the bee dies. So we're finding dead bees everywhere around her, but what that means is that she's stabbed herself with a toxin. All these, you know, sort of strange psychological makeups, because ultimately this is a book about grief for lost loves, that the character who believes that Saturn is spying on him is really in mourning for his lost wife. There's a metafictional element of an author who's written all of this stuff because he's also in mourning for his lost partner who's left him. So a lot of what lies at the heart of all these torments and sort of psychological strategies that are adopted are sublimation of lost love, which is very subversive because you don't, you know, you take this book on surface level that it's this strange world, but no, what that strange world is covering is the sort of yearning of lost love. It's brilliantly done. I really enjoyed it. 5 stars. And on to Nicola Barker, Tony Interruptor, her new book. So I'm just going to restate my relationship with Nicola Barker. She was always a name I associated with experimental writing. If you look at a book like Happy, which does a lot of amazing things with its fonts and colours of text and stuff like that, but ultimately they never satisfied me. But I admired the bravura that she would take on these, you know, these experimental journeys, and I appreciated her for that. And then after Happy, she basically said in an interview that she'd taken her experimentation as far as she could. And I actually think she implied she'd taken writing as far as it could. And her next book, which I'm not sure if it's listed here. No, because her books aren't listed. I'm really annoyed. I should have looked it up. Her next book after that interview was terrible. It was it was comedic, but it was just nothing experimental about it. It was so bad I gave it away. And this is the second one after that, or the first book after that, so the second after her interview. And again, there's nothing experimental about this, and I think I'm done with Nicola Barker. So the first thing to say is it's a satire. Well, if you're doing satire, you're not really giving us characters with any integrity, because they're there to represent the satire, to furnish the satire. So there's an awful lot of characters in here, and there's really only one that's interesting to me. The rest of them are there to service, as I say, service the message of the satire. What is it? So it's an improvisational jazz band. The lead soloist is a trumpeter. He's very much about improvisation and spontaneity. This is his way of opposing the world of hidebound rules, structure, and he is interrupted. He gets heckled from the audience by a man who says, "Are you being genuine? Are you being real?" And this guy, the interrupter, confronts him backstage, where a member of the audience and his daughter are there, and the daughter is filming on her camera. And the musician, the trumpeter, calls this guy Tony Interrupter. And that's captured on film, as is unfortunately later that same evening, where the trumpeter and the only female member of the band have a massive shouting match. That's captured again on this girl's camera. She uploads it. It goes viral. Both the Tony Interrupter and also this musician. And what we get is a book that's an inquiry into spontaneity versus hidebound rules, about art and improvisation versus much more deadened art, the role of the internet, what could be less real than cyber space and stuff done on that. So all these themes are there. I don't find them a very interesting representation, because this satire is on top of it. I had problems with the satire, with the choices that she made. So, for example, very early on in the book, one of the characters comments that the name Tony Interrupter sounds like the name of a music track by the band The Fall. And I love The Fall, and indeed the epigram to this book is from Mark E. Smith, who was the lead singer of The Fall. Now, if the book had been about a band, a rock and roll band, which is what The Fall were, emerging out of punk, although they were never themselves punk, I would have absolutely been there for it, but it's not. So she shifted from this sort of Fall-like band into a jazz improvisational ensemble. And yes, the Fall would create chaos on stage and would improvise and stuff like that, but it's not. So rock and roll is not jazz. They're two completely different things. So that was the first decision that I found baffling. The second thing is the scale of this. So we're told repeatedly that this all takes place in North Kent, which is it's not part of a major conurbation. It's small scale, and yet this internet meme has gone viral. I don't buy it. The scales are disproportionate, they're asymmetric. So again, I didn't really get into the premises of this book. It just didn't work for me on any level. So I'm going to read a couple of bits which I think were worthwhile, but they're sort of the exceptions that prove the rule, really. So this is about the band having an internal review where they should go to next. We should just reframe this situation as an opportunity to expand and involve artistically, Lacey volunteers. We should pivot. Sasha inhales deeply. What really messes with my head is my absolute certainty that all of the options you just offered me are completely wrong, and at the same time absolutely right. I mean, at this particular moment in history, It has never mattered more what you say, how you react, and at the same time it has never mattered less. The world is fucked, and I see no better or more sincere way of expressing this than through improvisation. There is no more fitting medium. I feel this in my very being. Now, more than ever, I long to grab my trumpet, slam it to my lips and just blow. There is a kind of violent urge in me to spew out disharmony as a way of making sense and meaning out of what is irrational, contradictory, absurd, anomalous, irresistible. And that, my dear Lacey, is honourable. It's fucking honourable. So bollocks to the rest of it. The bar-ing, the bleating, the digital fucking cacophony. Sasha repeatedly slams his hand down onto his thigh to hammer out his point in syllables. It will pass. It will pass. That's an interesting take on life lived online and how it's sort of bankrupting discussion and debate, but far more interestingly treated here than in here, where it's slightly throwaway because the whole thing's a satire. And another piece. So this is the daughter who the father is sort of accusing of. She has no ideas of her own, that all she's doing is filming and uploading other people's stuff. Is it really so hard to give me a bit of credit? Interrupts, lifting her eyes from their forensic inspection of the carpet. I filmed and then I edited something. I realised that it was interesting, that it had value, so I edited it and I promoted it. You act like it's nothing. She forms her hand into a fist and presses it unconsciously into the soft leather of the sofa. All Mallory, who's her stepmother, ever does is throw shade, and all you ever do is defend her. What you don't see, and she doesn't see either, is that life is in the editing. Knowing that something deserves capturing, editing and promoting means using your judgment. I use my judgment. You honestly have no confidence in me. You don't think I have any ideas of my own. I have a voice, Dad, and it's my voice. I actually have vision. I have intuition. I have style. Now, I think that's an important statement of where we're at in the 21st century in terms of art and creativity and imagination, and whether that has been tarnished through this sort of culture of sampling and remixing and all of that. But again, it's unsatisfying. It's lightweight somehow. And then finally, there are a lot of conversations here between the musicians, and they have day jobs, two of them university professors, a lot of them with their children and all of that. And again, this is India, the girl who took the film, who uploaded the stuff for the concert. Here she is rounding on her one of the musicians, or maybe it's her father, I can't remember, but the point is, this sums up what the whole book is. Why won't everyone, just be open about what is actually happening here, she demands. Engage with the true substance of the thing. Stop framing everything in terms of art and ideas and meaning. Stop communicating only in gestures and symbols. Stop always making everything so intellectual, so meta, and just for once in your life risk being real. So that's what this book is made up of. People having these intellectual conversations, and yet somehow they're unanchored and they're not given due weight. And the girl who just made that statement, she's complaining about how her father always holds discussions with her, which are about ideas and symbols and meanings, which they absolutely are. But she's also, in the bit I just read previous to that, what's she doing but uploading stuff that she's filming, that she says this has meaning, this has value, I'm going to capture it and basically re-release it. So she's also operating at the idea of gestures and symbols and supposed meaning. This book's just a mess. 2 stars. On to Catherine Lacey's Pew. A teenager of indeterminate age, of indeterminate gender, no one knows their name, and indeed the only thing that is determined is the colour of her skin, which is dark. She, as I say, is an itinerant, and one day at the start of the book she is found asleep on a pew in a church, where she's discovered as the parishioners come in for Sunday prayers. And being that this is a Christian community, a family, happily married wife and husband and their 3 kids, offer to take her home, give her shelter, give her food. And she doesn't talk, except in very isolated circumstances, which I'll get to. So there's no doubting the hospitality given by these God-fearing folk, but it's undercut with trust issues and suspicion, because this person is other. She's other by the colour of her skin, that all the Afro-Americans are on the other side of town, the poor end. She doesn't, they don't have a name, they don't talk, and most importantly, they're not, the townsfolk aren't sure what gender they are. So she represents other, which is a threat somehow, an unspoken threat. And all the time, through this hospitality that they're granting her, taking her to meet different people, to try and tease out of her information about her past life so they can help her, so they can better understand, sorry, I keep saying her, so they can understand them. It's not true. It is actually belying their, as I say, their suspicion of other and difference. Because this is a very homogenous town, God-fearing, white town, middle America. So it's a very interesting setup of this, Christian sort of faith and ideas and beliefs and how you should treat one's fellow man, which is all on display. But underneath it, there's this sort of little paranoid channel of suspicion and dread that undercuts it, which I think is a really interesting and accurate statement of what's going on in America amongst Christians, who are, of course, very to the fore of sort of MAGA and Trumpism and all that sort of stuff, which seems to go against everything that Christianity, or one vein of Christianity, stands for. Now, I said that she doesn't really talk. There are 2 or 3 people that she utters a single or a word or phrase to. I mean, she never unburdened. I keep calling her she, apologies. They never unburden, in the same way as they never take their clothes off. Hence why no one knows their true gender. Or at least their cisgender. And the people that she offers up a word to. So the first is a guy called Nelson, who's a refugee from a faraway war, whose parents were killed in that war, and has gone through this process of being sheltered and brought up and supported by a family, who is also of dark skin complexion. So they think his step-parents think that he's obsessed with card games, but what he's always used it for, he doesn't know how to play any card games. What he's always used it for was the excuse to go out and drink, that he smuggles out alcohol. And when our non-gendered hero stroke heroine meets up with him, they are impressed with his rebellion and the fact, obviously, he must share some of her experience because he's been through it before. So she offers Nelson a word. Another character that she offers a word is a woman called Tammy, who realises that this life of being the good Christian homemaker has basically emptied her out. There's nothing to her. She smokes very heavily. She watches TV. She sort of lies around, has the sort of snooze every afternoon. She's fully aware that her life is passing her by, and in her despair, in her melancholia, again, our sort of refugee character, our itinerant character, in a way appreciates her honesty and shares a word for her. There's another character who's the daughter of... so Nelson's adoptive parents have a rebellious daughter, and she basically is someone who can't understand, she sees through the sort of Christian community of, well, we should embrace our fellow man, but we should all be equal. And, she's constantly sent home from school as a troublemaker with difficult ideas, and is actually called by her school a communist. Again, very on point, very on message with contemporary America. So she too is offered a word from this non-speaking itinerant person. And we're building up towards what's called a Festival of Forgiveness amongst this community, a very important day in their calendar where they basically admit all their sins and cleanse themselves by being... Effectively, it's like a confession, but it's a mass confession. It's not to an individual priest. It's all done to the community as a whole. And that's what this book is building up to. And, of course, they're confessing sins as would be recognised in the Ten Commandments. But they're not confessing because they're unaware of the sin of not being open to otherness, not appreciating people different from yourselves, of being hermetic, which is a sort of... It's not a sin of action until maybe you do something that is directly sort of iniquitous. But it's a state of mind and a set of beliefs that actually are pretty sinful, but they're not sophisticated enough to realise that that's what they are, that's what they're like. So the book builds up to this festival. We go through the festival, the ritual, and then we have in which nothing, it wasn't striking enough because the whole book had been building up to it. It wasn't striking enough, and then we have the unsatisfactory conclusion. We know no more about this character who's called Pew, who's been nicknamed Pew because she was found on a pew. We know nothing more about them. We don't know why they don't talk. We don't know what their history. They don't have access to their own memory, so we're none the wiser. So there's no payoff in this book. So there's some interesting ideas in it. There's an interesting critique of American Christianity, I think, but slightly unsatisfying. 3 stars. And on to Nathalie Leger, Sweet for Barbara Loden. So this is, I suppose, autofiction. Barbara Loden was an American actress, but she did direct one film based on a true story. And that true story was of a woman who was completely bereft of everything in her life, just felt empty. She left her husband and kids, hooked up with this guy who was a bank robber, and she was going to rob a bank with him. But she was driving the getaway car. He was up ahead, and she took a wrong turning. So by the time she sort of got to the bank, he'd already been shot dead, and she was eventually captured. And she said to the judge, when he sentenced her to 20 years or whatever it was, she said to him, "Thank you." And Barbara Loden's film was an inquiry into this woman as to why she would thank the judge, because she'd had such a sort of empty life that somehow going to prison and giving her structure would give her more fulfilment, more meaning. And Barbara Loden played the role of this woman, that she saw herself in it. I do have a question about her thanking the judge, because you can thank the judge, sincerely, but you can also thank them sort of ironically, and that's never explored. It's assumed that this was a genuine, sincere thanking the judge for sorting her life out, or at least sort of bringing it to a premature end. But what if it was done as sort of irony? Anyway, so we have a series of refractions of the women involved here. So we have the bank robbing woman, or would-be bank robbing woman. We have Barbara Loden, the actress who directed the film based on her life but played her. And then we have Nathalie Leger, who was asked to write a sort of quick review or introduction of the film, but found that she couldn't just leave it, at a one-paragraph thing, that we get this whole book out of it. Because each of them are refractions of each other, but also their relationship with their mothers. Why does this woman feel so dissipated that she becomes passively agrees to hook up with this thug and become a bank robber? Why does Barbara Loden, what's the relationship with her mother, that she feels that this part was so her? And Nathalie Leger's relationship with her mother as she's writing this book. So we get all these series of refractions, and it's pretty standard, I would say, autofiction, with lots of cross-references and references to other cultural things. But the one bit of the book that I really loved, that was an absolute standout for me, is Barbara Loden meets Mickey Mantle, who was a famous baseball star, actually a record holder of the most home runs hit in a season until it was broken in the early 2000s. And Mickey Mantle's a working class hero. He comes from a family where he would have gone down the mines had he not shown this proficiency for baseball. And after he's retired, he's asked to write a book. And because of his sort of working class background, fairly uneducated, he feels he's not up to it. So what he undertakes is to educate himself. And he reads books so that he feels he will then be able to bring to the task the same level of professionalism as he did to being a baseball player. And when Loden meets him, they start having a conversation about Proust. And as as Leger, when Leger meets him, as Leger remarks in the text, you wouldn't expect this sort of working class hero to engage in a conversation about Proust. She's an author. She's read all these guys. She's au fait. She's up with the references. And here she's being engaged as an equal by this baseball star. And I did find that really, really interesting, that exchange. But it's perfectly fine. It's perfectly serviceable. I haven't seen the film. I get all the refractions. I give it a solid 3 stars. And finally, Dino Buzzati, The Singularity. So Dino Buzzati wrote the book The Tartar Steppe, which has a different title in America. I think it's called The Fortress in America. And this is, I think, a very good little book that has rather not dated well, which is obviously not Buzzati's fault. When was it written? 70s, 60s? 1960. So the book starts off with this university professor is engaged by the Italian government for a top secret mission. They won't give him any details. He does have the choice whether to accept or not, and his wife, his newly married wife, says, no, we should do it, it'd be great. And then we have very sort of Buzzati territory of the description of the drive to this top secret location, driving through the mountains, through snow, very much similar tone to the Fortress of the Tartar Steppe. And that's very engaging, I felt. It's really well written, well done. It's obviously Buzzati's strong point, his wheelhouse, his descriptions of this type of territory, environments. And then we get to the centre, the military centre, and they are building effectively a sort of a computer or a AI consciousness, which is why I say it's very badly dated, because of what we have now. But really, like this, it's a sort of a conduit to try and keep alive the memory of a lost love of the main scientist. So this machine, this sort of machine intelligence, is given a female characteristic based on his lost love. The most interesting thing about it is that the scientists who designed this AI consciousness wanted to make it non-verbal, because they felt as soon as you engage in language, meaning is fractured and its language is slippery, it's elliptical. So they wanted to design a non-verbal language for this character, for this machine to speak in, which it does, very much based on the sounds of, as I say, the lost love. And that's it really. It's a short book. It's engaging. It's a good fun read. It's a quick read. But ultimately, it is a victim of its times, because it's rather been that those notions of human AI consciousness and all that has been somewhat superseded by where we currently lie with the technology. As I say, though, I did find it interesting when the writing was talking about having a non-verbal language to really drive through to truth. But I gave it 3 stars. And that's it. That's been my last sort of reading period. Lots of good stuff there. I mean, Endling and Migraine could well both end up in my top 10 reads of the year. I thought The People of Paper was very strong, really enjoyed it. Madeleine Thien was, had so much to recommend. It didn't quite work as a whole run. And even the books that were sort of vaguely disappointing were, that's just a victim of its circumstance of when it was written. The Leger was solid. I was disappointed in the Barker, I have to say, and to some extent in Pew as well. But on the whole, I'd say a really good set of books for reading. So till next time, thanks very much.